It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood.
One of the first things that a child learns in a healthy family is trust. And I trust what you have said, that you will read this.
Fred Rogers was not only one of the early pioneers of children's television, but also a committed man to racial inclusivity. He was loved by many due to his focus on spreading messages of love, kindness, and acceptance. But following Mr. Rogers' death, some disturbing rumors about Mr. Rogers have come out, leading us to all question whether we truly knew the man at all. His children have recently commented on these rumors regarding their father. But before we get into these rumors, let us take some time to see how the amazing Mr. Rogers came to be the man we all adored. Early life. As the son of the McFeely Brick Company's president, Fred McFeely Rogers was born on the 20th of March 1928 in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, down 705 Main Street. Fred's father, James Hillis Rogers, was one of the most thriving businessmen in Latrobe. His mother was devoted to making well-knitted sweaters meant for the brave American soldiers who were in combat in Europe. She would regularly volunteer at the Latrobe Hospital in Pennsylvania, where she offered amazing services. Hospital volunteering was something that Fred's mother always loved to do. This was due to the fact that she was aspiring to be a doctor when she was a little girl, making her to passionately and diligently volunteer at the local hospital. Although Fred was born in 705 Main Street, he grew up some few blocks down the road at 737 Weldon Street in Latrobe. This was in a nice three-story house made of bricks. When Fred was 11 years old, his family adopted a young girl by the name Elaine, Fred's sister. Fred enjoyed playing the piano when he was as little as 5 years old, and most of the time he was a loner, spending his time playing with puppets. Here is a fun fact that many of you might have never known about Fred. If you have watched the 2019 film A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, the famous actor Tom Hanks plays a role that portrays Fred Rogers. This is not by chance. Fred Rogers and Tom Hanks are actually related. Tom Hanks happens to be the sixth cousin to Fred Rogers, through Johannes Meffert, their ancestor who was a migrant from Germany to the United States. Life for Fred was not easy growing up. He was often bullied by his peers due to his excessive weight, and was frequently being referred to as Fat Freddy. In addition to his introverted and shy nature, the bullying was just one of the few factors that made Fred a homebound kid who had previously suffered several asthmatic bouts. In relation to Fred's lonely childhood story, the director of Won't You Be My Neighbor, Morgan Neville, who directed the 2018 documentary piece, said the following words about Fred Rogers' childhood life. "Lonely childhood, I think he made friends with himself as much as he could. He had a ventriloquist dummy, he had stuffed animals, and he would create his own worlds in his childhood bedroom." Fred would later overcome his introverted and shy nature at Latrobe High School, where he attended classes. It was during his time in this high school that Fred made some real human friends, including the school's football team head. Most of the friends he made while in high school loved the guy and realized he wasn't so bad after all. Shockingly, the kid who was a shy introvert amazed the world by becoming the student council's president, the school yearbook editor-in-chief, and the National Honor Society member. Fred became a magna cum laude graduate with a Bachelor of Music in 1951 at Rollins College, having transferred from Dartmouth College where he only spent a year. He did not put his pen in the bag and forgot about it there. In the year 1962, Fred became a magna cum laude graduate with a Bachelor of Divinity from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. The following year, the Pittsburgh Presbytery, serving at the United Presbyterian Church, ordained Fred Rogers as a Presbyterian minister. Fred was not like any other ordinary minister. He often liked ministering through television to children more than being a normal church pastor. But in order to maintain his ordination, Fred would regularly appear before the officials of the church. I know you all must be wondering when Fred got into the television business. Early career. Well, during Fred's senior year when he was still at Rollins College, he happened to get some television experience when he was still at his parents' home. This experience played a critical role in enticing Fred to join the nascent medium of television. Fred would later open up on his choice to go to television in an interview with CNN, where he said the following words: "I went into television because I hated it so, and I thought there's some way of using this fabulous instrument to nurture those who would watch and listen." Fred used to work as the floor director for The Kate Smith Hour, Your Hit Parade, and Gabby Hayes' children's show at NBC. This was immediately after graduating from Rollins College. While still at NBC, Fred Rogers played the role of assistant producer in The Voice of Firestone. 2 years later, in 1953, Fred would find himself at WQED, a public television station located at Pittsburgh, where he worked as the program developer. It is during this time that he met and collaborated with Josie Carey to come up with The Children's Corner. This was a children's show that was being hosted by Carey. Off the camera, Fred was busy developing characters, puppets, and music that was being used for The Children's Corner show. Fred had mastered the art of creating pet characters during this time, and he made several characters for this show such as Queen Sarah Saturday, King Friday the 13th, Dorothy Daniel, Daniel the Striped Tiger, X the Owl, Lady Elaine, and Henrietta. It was during this time that Fred also worked with Ernie Coombs, the famous children's television entertainer who served as the assistant puppeteer in the show. This show was one of the best children's shows at the time, and not only did the show win Sylvania Award in the category of being the locally produced children's programming, but also got the chance to be broadcast by NBC on a national level. It was during this time working at the Children's Corner show that Fred decided to attend Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, where he got his ministerial ordination. Fred met and started working with Margaret McFarlane when he attended the University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Child Development. Margaret McFarlane was a psychologist who played a critical role in Fred's life. According to Maxwell King, who happens to be Fred Rogers' biographer, Margaret McFarlane was Fred's key advisor and collaborator, and also his child education guru. Margaret McFarlane played the role of Fred's consultant in the making of the songs and scripts for Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Margaret played this crucial role for 3 decades. Fred was contracted by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC, in 1963 in Toronto, where he was required to move to Toronto to work as the developer and host of Mr. Rogers. This was a black-and-white children's show that lasted for 15 minutes, and it was aired from 1963 all the way to 1967. The show was Fred's first appearance on camera. Fred Rainsbury was the man with the pep talk behind inciting Fred Rogers to appear on camera. Mr. Rainsbury, who was the head of children's programming at CBC, looked straight in Fred Rogers' eye and said, "Fred, I've seen you talk with kids. Let's put you yourself on the air." And just like that, Fred Rogers accepted the task. Ernie Coombs would later join Fred as the assistant puppeteer in Toronto. Fred would later collaborate with Coombs to come up with the amazing work which was known as Butternut Square, which was on air from 1964 all the way to 1967. In 1967, Fred left Toronto together with his wife and 2 children and decided to go back to Pittsburgh, carrying with him the sets that he had developed for the Mr. Rogers show after he had acquired the rights of the show. Shockingly, Fred was leaving behind a very promising CBC career, and he was heading to Pittsburgh, a place where he had an amazing 0 job prospects. When Rogers left Toronto, he recommended Coombs, who stayed behind as the Canadian equivalent of Fred, creating Mr. Dress Up, a children's program that hit the airwaves from 1967 to 1996. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. In 1968, one of Fred Rogers' masterpieces came to life. This was the time that Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, an 895-episode show, which had 30-minute-long episodes, was starting to get airplay, with Fred Rogers as the main star of the show. The famous show, which was aired by Public Broadcasting Service, PBS, formerly known as National Educational Television, NET, was being originally videotaped in Pittsburgh at WQED. The premiere season of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood contained a whopping 180 black and white episodes. The seasons that followed contained only 65 episodes each, and they were sponsored by the Sears Roebuck Foundation, PBS, among other amazing charities, ensuring the show ran successfully and being filmed in color. The show had recorded a 0.7% average rating of television households, which was equivalent to 680,000 homes spanning across 384 PBS stations. It also had a 2.1% average rating, equivalent to a whopping 1.8 million households during its peak period in 1985 to 1986. Although the show ended in 2001, PBS continued to bring reruns of the show, and by 2016, it was recorded as the third longest-running PBS program in history. Designers and producers of CBC in Toronto helped in the creation of the sets and props of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, such as the sneakers, the castle, and the trolley. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood's format was never changed throughout its lifetime. The episodes would normally begin with a neighborhood model, transitioning to a closer look at a house with the melodious piano theme song by Johnny Cost's "Won't You Be My Neighbor," which was inspired by Beethoven's sonata. There was a close camera concentration to a model that used to represent Rogers' house, cutting directly into the interior of the house, followed by room pans. Then the front door would open, and Rogers would appear to be singing along to the theme song, and he would greet his visitors while he was changing his suit jacket and putting on his sweater, which was followed by changing his shoes and putting on his sneakers. He would always do the signature move of tossing a shoe from one hand to the other. The theme of the episode would then be introduced, and Mr. Rogers would leave his house and visit a different location. This followed with a camera back pan to the original neighborhood model, before a close capture of the new location as he enters the new vicinity. After the end of the segment, Mr. Rogers would be seen leaving and heading back to what he termed as the neighborhood of make-believe. He would then proceed and set up action at the window seat as the trolley came out. This would be followed by the camera following it as it went down a tunnel, and it would later be seen entering the neighborhood of make-believe. With the involvement of both human characters and puppets, the lesson and the stories of the show would take a week-long episodes. The trolley would return to the same tunnel that it had initially emerged from to signify the end of an episode. It would reappear in Mr. Rogers' home, where he would have a small parting shot with the viewers before closing the show. Mr. Rogers would then be seen feeding his fish, and then he would clean some of the props, and then return to the initial place where he would change back to his initial jacket and his initial shoes. He would do all this while still singing the closing song. Unlike the other PBS show known as Sesame Street, which aired in 1969, and it mainly focused on the cognitive learning process, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood focused and emphasized mainly on the social and emotional needs of young children. While comparing the two shows, a woman by the name Kathy Murlock Jackson, who was a writer, said the following words: "While both shows target the same preschool audience and prepare children for kindergarten, Sesame Street concentrates on school readiness skills, while Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood focuses on the child's developing psyche and feelings and sense of moral and ethical reasoning." Also, unlike Sesame Street, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood spent very little resources on research. It was through Benjamin Spock, Eric Erikson, and Margaret McFarlane's concepts of early childhood development that mentored Rogers' creativity for the show. Fred Rogers used a leisurely cadence and a tone that was so reassuring to teach the young children on simple virtues such as sharing, self-worth, civility, and tolerance. A skill that was even noted by the Washington Post. Fred Rogers would tackle very difficult topics such as sibling rivalry, the death of a pet, a newborn addition into the family, changing of schools, and even complex matters such as divorce. One of the most remembered segments in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was the one that aired on June 7, 1968, about the assassination of President Robert F. Kennedy, airing just 2 days after the uneventful event. Rogers was very much dedicated to the course, as he was the man who personally did all the writing and editing of all the episodes. He was also the man in charge of playing the piano and singing all of the songs, and it happens that he created 13 operas and 200 songs during this time, and also was tasked with creating both the human and the puppet characters in the show. Apart from hosting each and every single show, Rogers was also tasked with playing some of the most significant puppet roles in the show, and he was in charge of the production and approving of the details in the entire show. Rogers formed the Family Communications, Inc., which is currently known as the Fred Rogers Company, in 1971. The Family Communications, Inc. was mainly focused on the production of The Neighborhood, some non-broadcast materials and other programs. Rogers decided to stop the production of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood in 1975 to focus on other things. As much as the production had stopped, PBS continued airing reruns of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. It was reported that the sudden stop did catch most of the co-worker unawares. Rogers made a comeback with the show in 1979. This comeback was seen to be a more sophisticated but stronger comeback. The comeback was so powerful that it even influenced some parodies to be created about the show. One of the most well-known parodies was the one that was being done by Eddie Murphy, which was known as Saturday Night Live, that was hitting the airwaves early in the 1980s. At the ripe age of 71, Fred Rogers decided to retire from producing Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. This was at the beginning of the 21st century in 2001. Although Rogers had retired, reruns of the great show were being aired. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood's final original episode was aired on TV screens on the 31st of August, 2001. This was the original grand finale of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Other works. Here is an amazing fact about Fred Rogers. Even before Fred was nationally known, he made an appearance before the Subcommittee of Communications of the U.S. Senate in 1969. This subcommittee was chaired by John Pasteur, who happened to be a Democrat senator of Rhode Island. There was a $20 million bill proposal that was made by Lyndon Johnson, who was the President of the United States of America at the time, and it was meant to help in the creation of PBS just before he left office. When the next president happened to assume office, who happened to be President Richard Nixon, he aimed at slashing down the proposed amount by his predecessor by half the amount to $10 million. Due to the persuasive arguments and the ability to connect with people emotionally, Fred Rogers was chosen to testify. The testimony that was shared by Fred Rogers was later televised, and it has always made rounds on the internet. This testimony was very powerful that it managed to help PBS to secure funding over so many years. This testimony has always been considered as one of the most powerful testimonies ever filmed and one of the most powerful testimonies shared before the American Congress. The testimony was so powerful that it brought John Pasteur to tears. Rogers was appointed as the chairman of the White House Conference on Children and Youth in 1970. Fred Rogers happened to visit Moscow in 1987 to make a guest appearance on Goodnight Little Ones, which was a long-running children's show in the Soviet Union, and it was being hosted by Tatiana Vedanayeva. This appearance that was made by Fred Rogers was aired on the 7th of December the same year in the Soviet Union. This was meant to coincide with the Washington Summit, which saw the meeting between the President of the United States at the time, who was Ronald Reagan, and Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union. The two were meeting at Washington, D.C. The leader of the Soviet Union decided to visit the set of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood in November the same year. This visit was only taped at the time, but the tape would later be aired as part of Fred's program the following year in March 1988. In 1996, Fred Rogers appeared on television as an actor, and not himself as many people had been used to. He played the role of a preacher in an episode of Dr. Quinn, the Medicine Woman. Fred Rogers was one of the few most sought speakers due to his eloquence and ability to connect with an audience. It is said that Fred made around 150 speeches in total. Many of the speeches that were made by Rogers were about children, education, his view of the world, television, and also how to make the world a better place. Not to forget, He would also make speeches on his quest for self-knowledge. It was crazy how he would command attention with a very quiet and informal tone. He had just mastered his art, and he was the best at what he did. He would often request his audience to just sit down and relax and think for a moment about someone who always had a good influence on them and their lives. He would always do this during his speeches, and one speech which is always remembered where he did this was when he won the Lifetime Achievement Emmy in 1997. He did the exact same thing during his induction to the Television Hall of Fame in 1999. Not to forget, he also did it again in the final commencement speech at Dartmouth College in 2002. Personal life. During his time in Rollins College, Fred Roger met a beautiful woman by the name Sarah Joanne Bird. The two quickly fell in love, and they decided to get married in 1952. This was a relationship that lasted for a golden jubilee until Fred Rogers passed away in 2003. The two lovebirds spent quality time together, and they were blessed enough to get two wonderful children. These two were James and John. Fred's wife, Sarah Joanne Bird, was one very accomplished pianist. Just like her husband, she was also a graduate with a bachelor degree in music. Sarah then decided to further her studies and went to Florida State University to do her master's in music. Rogers protested against wearing animal furs. As a matter of fact, at one point of his life, Rogers was a vegetarian. He usually said that he was a vegetarian for his own ethical reasons and also for health reasons. Although Rogers was at one time registered as a Republican, he was always impartial. His wife Sarah Bird used to say that Fred Rogers would hold off his political views, and he was very independent on the way he voted, despite the fact that he was a registered Republican. As a Presbyterian, most of the values that Rogers always shared when he was making Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood were mostly inspired by true Christian doctrines. Most of the time, while on air, he would never speak about his faith. This was down to one reason: Fred Rogers believed that actions speak louder than words. He did not just teach by mouth, but he would often teach by example. He showed this when he once said the following words: "You don't need to speak overtly about religion in order to get a message across." He always believed in his actions to be the best way to pass a message. Whenever he was on TV, he would consider the space between the TV and his viewers as holy ground, and so he viewed it as a place where he could come and pass a message that would make the world a better place, and he would always touch the hearts of many and make them become better than they came in to watch his shows on TV. Death. When Rogers retired from PBS, he spent most of the time studying religion and spirituality, making appearances, working with FCI, and also traveling. By this time, Rogers was developing chronic stomach pain. By 2002, he was experiencing very severe pain that he decided that it was now time to see a doctor, for he could no longer take it. Unfortunately, Fred was diagnosed with stomach cancer in October 2002. He also happened to delay treatment until January 6, 2003, when he underwent a surgical operation. This entire delay was simply because of his need to serve at the 2003 Rose Parade with the likes of Bill Cosby and Art Linkletter, where Fred was the Grand Marshal. Barely 2 months after Fred had undergone the medical surgery, on the 27th of February in the year 2003, Fred McFeely Rogers was no more. He kicked the bucket peacefully at his home with his wife Sarah Joanne by his side. He was on the cover of many of the papers the following morning. The world was in sorrow for losing such an amazing great man who always spread love and hope to so many people. Fred was laid to rest on May 3, 2003. The rumors. Just after Fred was laid to rest, there were rumors that started spreading about the man that shocked the world. These rumors had spread so much that they even felt like they were true to some extent. People started saying that Fred was a Navy SEAL who had committed many confirmed killings, and that he even had tattoos on his body that were meant to commemorate the people that he had killed. Recently, James and John came out to speak about the rumors. They said that their father was never a Navy SEAL, nor had he ever made any killings in his life. Fred Rogers was the same man in real life, just as the way he was being depicted, a humble and loving man. With that being said, and the rumors now cleared off, Fred Rogers may have gone, but his good deeds and loving messages will forever live inside our hearts.